She signed over her house. She emptied her savings account. She gave up her career, her health, her future, for the people she loved most in this world. And the night she called them from a hospital bed, fighting for her life, not one of them picked up the phone. Not one. The woman who had spent 30 years making sure everyone else was okay, lay alone in a hospital room at 2 in the morning, listening to voicemail after voicemail, wondering how on earth it had come to this. This is not a story about a stranger. This is a story about a mother, a sister, a daughter, a woman who did everything right and still ended up with nothing. The question is not what she gave. The question is, why did they let her fall? Stay with me, because by the end of this story, you are going to ask yourself one question that is going to keep you up at night. How well do you really know the people you love? Her name was Sandra. Sandra Marie Holloway, 58 years old, Columbus, Ohio. A woman who, by every outward measure, had done everything the right way. She had a career she built from scratch, a home she paid for herself, slowly, over 2 decades, a reputation in her church, her community, and her family as the one you called when things fell apart. And things fell apart a lot. Not for Sandra, but for everyone around her. Sandra was the kind of woman who answered the phone on the first ring, who showed up before you finished asking, who somehow always had something to give, even when she had quietly been running on empty for years. Before we go any further into Sandra's story, we want to pause and ask you something right now. Where are you watching this from? Drop it in the comments below. We would love to hear from you. And if you have not already, please hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos, because the stories we bring to this channel are the ones that do not let you go. To understand why Sandra gave the way she did, you have to go back much further than any single crisis. You have to go all the way back to a green and white house on the Near East Side of Columbus, Ohio, in the summer of 1974. Sandra was 8 years old. The neighborhood where she grew up sat along the Livingston Avenue corridor, a stretch of Columbus that had once been one of the city's first streetcar suburbs, a place of wide front porches and old trees, and houses that had been built when people still believed that permanence was something a neighborhood could hold on to. By the time the Holloways arrived, the neighborhood had changed. The interstate construction of the 1960s had cut through the black community's historic center just to the west, displacing families, erasing institutions, rerouting the geography of belonging. What remained was a neighborhood that held on with the particular dignity of a community that has survived being unmade and has chosen, stubbornly, to remain. Robert Holloway worked double shifts at a manufacturing plant on the south side of Columbus for most of Sandra's childhood. He was a tall, quiet man, with large, capable hands, and the unhurried movements of someone who has learned that the body is a tool and must be treated as such if it is going to last. He left for work before Sandra was awake most mornings. She learned his departure by sound, the creak of the third stair, the soft close of the front door, the particular engine sound of his truck backing out of the narrow driveway. She would lie in her bed in those first minutes of morning and listen to the house settle into the shape of his absence. And she understood, even at that age, something that she would not have the words for until much later, that love and presence are not always the same thing, and that a person can fill a house with love even when they are rarely inside it. Robert Holloway loved his family with everything he had. What he had, mostly, was work. Her mother, Evelyn, was warm and funny and sick in the way that some people are sick for so long that the illness becomes indistinguishable from the person, not defining them exactly, but woven into everything, shaping the texture of every day. Rheumatoid arthritis had arrived in Evelyn's body in her late 20s and had been working its way through her joints ever since, with the particular cruelty of a disease that flares without warning and retreats without explanation, keeping you always slightly off balance, always uncertain of what tomorrow's body would be capable of. On good days, Evelyn cooked and cleaned and laughed at the kitchen table and was the center of gravity of the house in the way that mothers are when they are fully present. On bad days, she was in bed, the room dim, her hands too stiff to hold a glass without pain, the distance between herself and the kitchen, a journey she could not make without help. Sandra was 8 years old the first time she understood that she was the help. It was a Saturday in the summer of 1974. Robert was at the plant for a double shift. Evelyn had been in bed since Thursday. Renee was 5, still at the age where the world is primarily a place of interesting things, and the concept of something being seriously wrong has not yet fully arrived. Sandra got up that morning and made cereal for herself and Renee, washed both bowls without being asked, then went down the hall and knocked softly on her mother's door. Evelyn needed water, then her medication, then help to the bathroom. Then Sandra straightened the bed covers and cracked the window because her mother said the room felt heavy. By the time she was done, it was nearly noon, and Renee was watching cartoons, and the morning had happened the way mornings did in that house, with Sandra holding the quiet center of it, at 8 years old, without anyone asking and without anyone noticing. That is where it started. Not with a dramatic moment, not with a declaration. It started with a glass of water on a Saturday morning, and it was repeated so many hundreds of times over so many years that it became Sandra's understanding of what love required. It became her first language. And the thing about first languages is that even when you learn others, the first one lives in the body in a way the others never quite do. It is the one you return to without thinking in moments of stress and love and urgency. Darnell Jerome Holloway was born in 1976, when Sandra was 10 years old. She remembered the day her mother came home from the hospital with him, a small, warm, impossibly serious-faced bundle wrapped in a yellow blanket, handed to Sandra while Evelyn rested, and Sandra stood in the living room, holding her baby brother with both arms, and felt something open in her chest that she had not known was closed. She loved him immediately, totally, without condition, in the way that people love things they did not know they needed until those things existed. She was 10 years old, and she understood, with the clear-eyed certainty of a child who has already been doing adult work for 2 years, that this was someone she was going to take care of. Not because anyone told her to, because it was simply true, the way the sun was true, the way the house on Livingston Avenue was true, a fact so fundamental it never occurred to her to question it. By the time Darnell was walking and talking, Sandra was in high school and already the most reliable person in the Holloway household, by a significant margin. She walked him to the park on weekend afternoons, pushing the stroller along Livingston Avenue, while Evelyn rested, pointing out dogs and birds and trucks, and naming them with the patience of someone much older, watching Darnell's face do the things small children's faces do, when the world is still primarily a series of astonishments. She taught him to read before he started kindergarten, sitting on the living room floor in the evenings with library books she had checked out herself, pointing at words and waiting while he sounded them out, praising him with a warmth that he would associate with her specifically for the rest of his life. She went to his school events, his Little League games, his parent-teacher conferences when Evelyn was not well enough to attend, sitting in the bleachers or in the plastic school chairs with a pride that was indistinguishable from what a mother would feel because the line between sister and second mother had been blurred so early and so thoroughly in their relationship that neither of them could have cleanly found it. Darnell grew up knowing that Sandra was the person who showed up. He knew it the way children know the laws of physics, not as something learned but as a feature of the world so fundamental that questioning it never occurs to you. That knowledge, absorbed early and never examined, would carry forward into his adult life, in ways that would cost both of them more than either of them understood, until it was very nearly too late. Renee Christine Holloway was born in 1969, 3 years after Sandra, and she was a different kind of person in nearly every way that mattered for the story of what would eventually happen to this family. Where Sandra was steady and organized and most comfortable operating from the background, Renee arrived in every room as though she had been announced. She was magnetic even as a child, easy in social situations, possessed of a smile that people returned before they knew they were doing it, comfortable being seen in a way that Sandra had never been and had long since stopped trying to be. She was not calculating about it. The magnetism was genuine. It was simply who she was. The way Sandra's steadiness was simply who Sandra was. Both of them shaped by the same house and the same parents and the same early years, and yet as different as two people who share blood can be. What nobody in the family, including Sandra, fully examined was the structural relationship between those differences. Sandra's steadiness had freed Renee from the necessity of developing it. The responsible one had always been taken care of. Renee had grown up in the particular freedom of a child who never had to worry about the floor because her older sister had quietly been holding it up. That freedom, never named, never acknowledged as the gift it was, had produced a woman who had never fully developed the muscle of managing difficulty without being supported through it. This is not blame. It is architecture. And like all architecture, it was built by people who were just living their lives, not by anyone who set out to build something harmful. Sandra and Renee loved each other with the complicated, layered, sometimes bruising love of sisters who have grown up in the same small house and seen each other at their worst and best, and every complicated variation in between. They had fought as teenagers. Real fights, door slamming, the specific cruelty that sisters can visit on each other because they know exactly where the tender places are, because they have been watching each other long enough to have mapped every vulnerability. They had also stayed up past midnight talking, Sandra making tea and listening while Renee cried over a broken heart at 17, saying she was going to die, and Sandra saying, "No, you are not," and meaning it with complete conviction. They had that. They had decades of that. The shared childhood, the parents, the Sunday mornings that smelled like their father's pancakes, and Marvin Gaye on the kitchen radio. All of that was real, and it mattered deeply. And it was also, over time, the thing that made Sandra unable to see clearly what was forming between them, because you cannot see the shape of a thing when you have been inside it your whole life. Robert Holloway died in October of 1989. He was 51 years old. Sandra was 23, in her first year of work in the Columbus City School District, as a junior administrator, staying late at her desk one evening, finishing a budget report, when the call came from the emergency room. She drove to the hospital in her second-hand Honda with her hands tight on the wheel, praying in the negotiating kind of way that is really just the mind trying to run faster than what the body already knows is true. Robert had suffered a massive heart attack. He was already fading by the time she arrived. Evelyn was in the hallway with both hands flat against the wall behind her, unable to go in, her face doing something Sandra had never seen it do before and would not forget. Renee was 20 years old and sitting in a plastic chair with her arms around herself. Darnell was 13, too young for this, knowing it, trying not to show it in the way that 13-year-old boys try not to show things. Sandra went in. She sat with her father. She held his hand and said the things you say when the time has contracted to its final narrow point, and the only thing left is to make sure the person knows they were loved and they do not need to be afraid. The monitors went flat at 11:47 in the evening. Sandra stayed with him for a few minutes in the silence of the room. Then she got up, smoothed the front of her jacket, and walked back out into the hallway to her family. She made the calls that night. Over the following days, she handled the funeral arrangements, the paperwork, the union notification, the insurance questions, the thank you notes after the service, the management of the casseroles and flower arrangements that arrived at the Livingston Avenue house in the week following the burial. She was 23 years old, and she did all of it without once suggesting that it should be any other way. Because in the Holloway family, this was what Sandra did. The family, in its grief, let her do it the way you let the person who has always managed things continue to manage them. Because rebuilding the structure of responsibility in the middle of grief is the last thing anyone has capacity for. And Sandra did not ask them to rebuild it. She simply continued to carry it, the way she had been carrying it since she was 8 years old on a Saturday morning with a glass of water. After Robert died, the family's center of gravity shifted in a way that was permanent, with Evelyn managing her health on a fixed income in the house on Livingston Avenue, with Renee in her early 20s, and Darnell still a teenager who needed shepherding through high school and then through the uncertain first years of adulthood. The practical weight of the Holloway family's stability redistributed itself entirely onto the one person who had always been willing to hold it. Sandra was the employed one, the stable one, the one with the apartment that was clean and the refrigerator that had food in it, and the phone that was always answered on the first ring. She was the person you called when things went wrong, and things went wrong regularly, in the quiet, grinding way that things go wrong in families that are held together by one person who has never been taught to say no, and surrounded by people who have never been required to hear it. There is a specific kind of loneliness that belongs to the person in a family who holds everything together, and it is not the loneliness of being ignored or unloved. It is the loneliness of being needed so constantly and so completely that there is very little room left for anything else, including the ordinary human experiences of being uncertain, being afraid, being someone who does not always know what to do next, being a person who occasionally needs to be held rather than doing the holding. Sandra was loved by her family. That is not in question. She was loved the way people love the person they know will always be there, with the ease and confidence and slight inattentiveness of someone who has never had reason to worry about that person's continued presence. The people who are always there are always loved. They are just rarely prioritized, because people direct their urgency and their attention toward the things that feel fragile, the things that might break, and Sandra had never been fragile, or had never allowed herself to appear fragile, which over enough time amounts to the same thing. By the time Sandra was 30 years old, she had built a genuinely good life for herself. She owned a 3-bedroom house on the north side of Columbus that she had purchased in 2001 and was paying off ahead of schedule through disciplined monthly overpayments that her colleagues at the school district teased her about, calling her the most organized woman in Ohio, in a tone that was equal parts admiration and something that had no name but that Sandra received with a quiet, private pleasure. She had a retirement account she contributed to every single month without exception, automatic and deliberate in the way that everything Sandra did was automatic and deliberate. She had been promoted twice at the Columbus City School District and had a reputation among her colleagues as someone with an extraordinary gift for making complexity manageable, for looking at a problem that everyone else was circling nervously and walking straight toward it and saying, clearly and without drama, here is what we need to do. She had friends, real ones, women she had known for years, people she went to church with at Greater Emmanuel Baptist on the east side of Columbus, where she had been a member since her mother first brought her as a child, a church that smelled of old wood and floor wax and the specific warmth of a community that has been gathering in the same place long enough to have absorbed the accumulated presence of everyone who has prayed there. Her life, from the outside, looked full and solid and well-constructed. From the inside, it was all of those things and also something she had never named, something she carried so quietly that she had long since stopped feeling its weight as separate from herself. She had never been in a long-term romantic relationship, not because the opportunity had not presented itself. It had, several times, men who were interested and decent and worth being interested in return, but the emotional availability required to build something real with another person was rarely accessible to Sandra, consistently occupied as it was by the needs of everyone around her. There had been a man named James in her early 30s, a high school history teacher who made her laugh in the specific way that very few people could, who was patient and attentive, and who told her once, sitting across from her at a restaurant table after she had cut a date short to take a call from Darnell about a crisis that turned out to be manageable, that he felt like he was always waiting in line behind everyone else in her life. Sandra had not had an answer to that. She had sat with it for a long time after they stopped seeing each other, turning it over in her mind, looking for the place where he was wrong. She could not find it. She told herself she was content with her life as it was. She was, in the way that people are content with the only version of things they have ever known, which is genuinely and also incompletely, like being satisfied with a meal you have never tasted the full version of. In 2005, when Sandra was 39, Renee married Marcus Webb at a ceremony in a downtown Columbus hotel ballroom that cost, by Sandra's quiet estimate, somewhere in the neighborhood of $18,000. Marcus was 41, handsome in the easy, unhurried way of a man who has always known he was handsome and has long since stopped thinking about it, possessed of a charm that worked on almost everyone in a room, and a quality that Sandra noted from their very first meeting without being able to name it immediately. It took her several hours after that first dinner to find the word. The word was momentum. Marcus Webb was a man of pure forward momentum. He was so focused on the destination in his mind that the ground directly beneath his feet was perpetually slightly out of focus, slightly unexamined, slightly less real to him than the place he was certain he was heading. He worked in commercial real estate, and he had ideas, and his ideas had a consistent shape across the years. Sandra watched them, large, plausible, financially ambitious, and perpetually requiring capital that was coming from somewhere just slightly ahead of where he currently stood. Renee believed in Marcus with the completeness that Renee brought to everything she chose to believe in, totally, beautifully, without the hedging and qualification that might have been more protective, if less romantic. She loved him in the way that women love men who make them feel like the world is bigger than it looked before, and Marcus did make the world feel bigger. He had a gift for that. Sandra watched them at the wedding reception, Marcus working the room with a warmth and easy confidence that was genuinely compelling. Renee beside him, radiant in the way that women are radiant when they believe completely in the life they have chosen, and Sandra felt two things at once: a sincere happiness for her sister's happiness, real and uncomplicated in the moment, and something else underneath it that she could not name and chose not to examine. She danced at the reception. She gave a toast that made people cry in the good way. She drove home alone at midnight and sat in her kitchen in the quiet of her house for a while before going to bed, and if she was aware of any particular weight in that sitting, she did not spend time with it. She had an early meeting the next morning. The first time Marcus's business needed something from Sandra came in 2007, 2 years into the marriage. A real estate deal in its early stages had developed a cash flow gap that needed bridging for 60 days. The ask came through Renee, which was how it would always come, never directly from Marcus, always through Renee, always delivered in Renee's voice, with Renee's particular blend of confidence and warmth, as though the request were so reasonable that the only question was the logistics. $9,000. Sandra was 41. She asked careful, specific questions about the deal structure, the timeline, the other investors involved. She noted Renee's answers with the practiced attention of someone who has been managing budgets and people and complex situations for 18 years, and she registered somewhere beneath the careful attention that the answers were fluent in a way that suggested rehearsal more than direct knowledge, that Renee was repeating what Marcus had told her to say, rather than speaking from her own understanding of the situation. Sandra wrote the check. The money came back 7 months later, not 60 days, and without the promised interest, but it came back, and the partial return meant that a template had been established. The money went out, the money came back eventually and incompletely, and the relationship continued, without the gap between promise and reality ever being named directly. Sandra filed it away. She did not confront anyone. She moved forward in the way she moved through most difficulties, with a quiet, practical acceptance that was its own form of damage, because it removed the consequence that might have produced a different pattern if it had been allowed to land. Darnell's first real financial crisis arrived in 2009. He was 33 years old, had been working at a logistics company for just under 2 years, living in an apartment near downtown Columbus that he could afford as long as the job held. The job did not hold. A round of layoffs cut his position in the fall of 2009, and the severance was spent by December, and by January of 2010, he was 3 months behind on rent and had a 2-year-old daughter named Maya, born in 2007, whose mother Cheryl was doing her best, but whose own situation was not stable enough to cover what Darnell could not. Sandra got the call on a Sunday morning. She was in her garden, wearing her gloves, turning the winter soil over in the particular methodical way she worked outdoors, deliberate, unhurried, the kind of physical work that let her mind go quiet in a way that nothing else quite managed. Her phone buzzed, and she peeled off one glove and looked at the screen and saw Darnell's name, and felt, beneath the love that his name always produced, a preparatory tightening that had become so automatic she barely registered it anymore. She answered. He talked. She listened. He was not dramatic about it. Darnell had an instinct, developed over years of asking, for the tone that worked with Sandra, which was the tone of a man who is genuinely ashamed of needing help, but is being honest about needing it anyway. That shame was real. It is important to hold on to that. He genuinely hated asking. He genuinely intended each time to be the last time. He genuinely believed, when he told her he was going to pay her back, that he would. None of that changed what the pattern produced over the years. Sandra transferred $3,500 before the end of that Sunday. She did not make him ask twice. She never made any of them ask twice. Maya was the variable in this equation that Sandra's heart was never fully able to rationalize around, And that fact alone tells you something essential about the kind of woman Sandra Holloway was. She met her niece properly for the first time at a 4th of July cookout at Evelyn's house when Maya was 3 years old. Maya walked up to Sandra 20 minutes into the gathering and stood directly in front of her with a piece of watermelon in one hand and the serious, evaluating gaze of a small child who has decided to assess you honestly before investing further. And Sandra looked back at her and felt something happen in her chest that was very close to what she had felt the first time she held Darnell at 10 years old. The fast, total, irreversible love that does not ask permission and does not consult practicality and simply arrives, fully formed, and stays. Maya had Darnell's laugh when it came, which was less often than in other children, but more arresting for its rarity. A laugh that seemed to surprise even her when it broke through the characteristic seriousness of her face. She called Sandra auntie, and she said it with a particular weight that made it sound like an entire sentence, like a word that contained in it, "You are mine, I am yours, and I am glad that is true." Sandra took Maya to the Columbus Zoo when she was 4. She took her to the main branch of the Columbus Metropolitan Library on Saturday mornings when she was 5 and 6 and 7, and it became a ritual that Maya looked forward to all week, reminding Darnell every Thursday that Saturday was coming and Auntie Sandra was coming, and could they please not be late this time. Sandra helped with Maya's school supplies every fall without being asked, showing up at Darnell's apartment in August with a backpack and folders and pencils and the specific things Maya had mentioned wanting, because Sandra had been paying attention when Maya mentioned them, in the way that Sandra paid attention to everything, carefully, quietly, filing it for later. Maya was the reason Sandra never fully closed the door on Darnell, no matter how many times the pattern repeated. Not the only reason, but the reason she could not examine too closely without the accounting becoming impossible, because Maya was not a line item. Maya was a child who had not chosen any of this, whose stability was in some genuinely meaningful way connected to whether her father's floor held, and Sandra could not look at that child and choose the clean version of things. Between 2010 and 2018, the requests came with the regularity of seasons. Darnell called in 2011 when the car needed repairs that the new job required and that the new job's first paycheck had not yet arrived to cover. Sandra paid $1,500. He called in 2012 when Maya's school had a fee for a trip that Cheryl could not cover and that Darnell was short on. Sandra sent the money before Darnell had finished explaining. He called in 2013 when a dispute with a landlord left him needing first and last month's rent on a new apartment on short notice, and Sandra wired $2,200 on a Wednesday afternoon and went back to the budget meeting she had stepped out of without mentioning to anyone in the room what had just happened. Each time the call came, Sandra answered. Each time, she found something to give. And each time, in the hours and days after, she experienced a version of the same quiet transaction, the relief of having helped, and underneath it, in a place she did not spend time in, a subtraction that she did not write down and did not tally, because tallying it would have required looking at it, and looking at it would have required deciding what she thought about what she saw. Renee and Marcus were a different rhythm, but the same song. The $9,000 in 2007 was followed by a smaller ask in 2010, a payment Sandra made toward a credit card that had reached its limit during a period Marcus described as a temporary cash flow correction. $6,000 in 2012 for a down payment on a property Marcus was convinced would triple in value within 18 months. That property did not triple. It sold in 2014 at a modest loss, and the $6,000 went with it, and Renee called Sandra to explain what had happened with the particular rehearsed fluency she had developed for exactly these moments, using words like disappointing and unfortunate, and we really thought this one was different, and ending the call with the sentence that she used in variations of itself every single time. I know you understand, Sandra. You always do. Sandra always said she understood. She was not lying when she said it. She did understand. In the careful, controlled way of a person who has decided that understanding is safer than confronting, that absorbing the loss is preferable to the alternative of what naming it directly might cost. She understood. She filed it away. She moved forward. What nobody in Sandra's family knew And what Sandra had not yet permitted herself to fully see was that the filing away had a cumulative weight that was changing something in her body even as she managed it so well on the surface. She was sleeping less. Not dramatically, she was not lying awake in obvious distress, but the quality of her sleep had shifted, shallowed, become a lighter and more vigilant kind of rest. The sleep of someone who is always slightly waiting for the next call. Her blood pressure, which she had been managing with a low-dose medication since her mid-40s, had crept upward in ways that her doctor noted at annual checkups with mild concern, and that Sandra acknowledged and then did not think about again until the next annual checkup. She was eating less carefully than she once had, not because she had stopped caring, but because the act of cooking for herself, of sitting down for a proper meal alone in her own house, had come to feel like a ceremony she did not always have the energy to perform. These were small things. Each one, in isolation, was negligible. All of them together were the body keeping an accounting that the mind had chosen not to keep. In 2018, Sandra was 52 years old and sitting at what she would later describe as an unusual moment of equilibrium. Her retirement account had recovered from an earlier withdrawal and held just under $90,000. Her house was nearly paid off, 2 years of payments remaining. Her salary at the school district was the highest it had ever been. She allowed herself, briefly, a version of the feeling that everything was in order. She sat in her garden on a Saturday morning that October and looked at the tomatoes she had grown that summer, the last of them still on the vine in the thin autumn light, and felt something approaching peace. She should have protected that feeling with everything she had. The call about the roof came 5 months later. Evelyn Holloway had been living alone in the house on Livingston Avenue for nearly 30 years by the spring of 2019, and the house had aged in the way that houses age when they are inhabited by a single person on a fixed income who loves the place but cannot always afford to maintain it. Things had been accumulating for years: a window that leaked when it rained hard enough, plumbing that made sounds at night that plumbing should not make, a furnace that Sandra crossed her fingers about quietly every winter. The roof was the most visible of the problems and had been deteriorating through 2 difficult weather seasons without being properly addressed, partly because the estimates were high and Evelyn's Social Security income did not cover high, and partly because both Darnell and Renee had their own explanations for why right now was not the ideal time for them to contribute to it. Sandra drove over to the Livingston Avenue house on a Saturday morning in April of 2019 to look at the roof herself. She stood in the driveway and looked up at it with the practical, unsentimental eye of a woman who had been managing the physical infrastructure of this family for 30 years, and what she saw confirmed what she had been quietly anticipating. The roof was not patchable. It needed to be replaced entirely, and it needed to be replaced before the next hard rain season made the interior damage worse than the structural damage already was. She called Dennis Carter, a contractor she had used for work on her own house twice before, and whose estimates she trusted because he had never once tried to inflate them or add work she had not asked for. Dennis came out the following Tuesday, walked the perimeter, climbed up to examine the surface, came back down, with the look of a man who is about to say a number he wishes were smaller. $14,200 for a full replacement. Evelyn's homeowner's insurance, after Sandra spent 2 hours on the phone navigating the claims process that her mother had not been able to navigate alone, agreed to cover $4,000 of it. The remaining $10,200 needed to come from somewhere. Sandra called Darnell that evening. She explained the situation clearly, the way she explained everything. Organized, without drama. Here are the facts and here is what needs to happen. Darnell listened. He was quiet for a moment after she finished. Then he said he was between things right now, that he had just left one job and was starting something new in a few weeks, that the timing was genuinely terrible and he felt awful about it. Sandra heard the shame in his voice and she felt, as she always felt when she heard that particular shame in Darnell's voice, the instinct to relieve it overpower the instinct to hold the line. She said it was okay. She said she would figure it out. She called Renee the next morning. Renee said the timing was impossible. Marcus had just committed capital to a new project, and they were stretched in ways that were temporary but real, and she was so sorry, she wished she could do more. Sandra was an absolute angel for handling it. Sandra said she understood. She withdrew $14,000 from her retirement account on a Thursday morning, paid Dennis Carter in full, and called her mother to tell her it was handled. Evelyn said, "Thank you, baby," in the voice that carried both gratitude and guilt in equal measure, the voice of a woman who knows she is receiving more than she is able to give back and has no remedy for that knowledge. Sandra said it was nothing. She had said those words so many times across so many years that they had the ease and automaticity of a reflex. It was not nothing. It had never been nothing. But she had learned so long ago to present it as nothing that the performance and the belief had become, on the surface at least, indistinguishable. She made a plan to replace the $14,000. She increased her automatic retirement contribution by $200 a month and wrote it on a notepad she kept in her kitchen drawer, the private accounting she had been maintaining for years, without consciously naming it as such. She told herself she would have the deficit covered within 6 years. It was a reasonable plan. It did not account for August, which was still 4 months away and was coming regardless. The call from Darnell in August of 2019 came on a Wednesday evening while Sandra was at her kitchen table, going through paperwork from the school district, the kind of end-of-day administrative work she had always done at home because the office was too loud, and the evenings in her own house were the only reliably quiet time she had. Her phone rang, and she looked at the screen, and the preparatory tightening came before she had consciously registered it. The way the body learns to brace for things the mind is still catching up to. She answered. Darnell's voice had a particular quality that evening that she recognized without effort, the quality that meant things had gotten bad enough that the calling could not be put off any longer. A tightness beneath the casual tone he always tried to open with, a kind of rehearsed lightness that was just slightly too deliberate to land as light. He asked how she was doing. She said fine. He said that was good, that was real good, and then the casual tone loosened and the real voice came through, and he told her he was 3 months behind on rent. His landlord, a man named Terry, who had been extending him patience for longer than patience was technically warranted, had sent a formal notice. The new job he had mentioned in April had not materialized in the way he had expected it to. He was working part-time at a distribution center, and it was not covering what needed to be covered. And Maya was living with him that school year. Cheryl was managing a health situation in Cleveland that made having Maya full-time temporarily impossible. And Darnell was her father, and he was doing the right thing by having her. But doing the right thing required a roof, and the roof required $4,200 that he did not have. Sandra was quiet for a moment after he finished. She was not calculating whether to help. She had known within the first 30 seconds of the call that she was going to help, in the same way she had always known, because Darnell's need and her response to it had long since stopped being a decision and had become something more like a law of the particular gravity that governed this family. What she was doing in that quiet moment was something she could not have named clearly even if she had tried, something between grief and love and the specific exhaustion of a person who is tired in a way that sleep does not address. Then she heard Darnell say Maya's name again, quietly, not as leverage. She knew the difference, even then, just as the honest center of what he was frightened about. And Sandra said she would take care of it. She wired $4,200 before 9 o'clock that evening. She went back to her district paperwork. She did not sleep particularly well that night, but she had not been sleeping particularly well for a while, and she had learned to treat insufficient sleep the way she treated most difficulties, as a condition to be managed and moved through, rather than a signal requiring attention. The winter of 2019 was quiet, by the standards of what the Holloway family's winters tended to produce. Sandra paid off her house in January of 2020, 2 years ahead of the original schedule, and sat with that for an evening, in a way that felt simultaneously like an achievement and like something she could not quite inhabit fully, because the retirement account that should have been her other major accomplishment of this season was $14,000 lighter than it should have been, and the monthly contributions she had increased to compensate were offset by the interest accruing on a small personal loan she had taken to manage a cash flow gap in October. She wrote the numbers down on her notepad. She looked at them for a while. She put the notepad in the drawer. She made herself a glass of wine and sat in her living room and looked at the walls of her paid-off house and tried to feel the victory cleanly. There were moments that evening when she could. Then the phone would ring in her mind. the way it rang sometimes even when it was not ringing, and the moment would shift slightly, the way a room shifts when a cloud passes over the sun outside. Everything technically the same, and somehow different. In March of 2020, the logistics company where Darnell had finally secured a stable position shut its Columbus facility as part of a broader operational restructuring. Darnell lost his job on a Thursday and called Sandra on a Friday, and by that point, the pattern was so established between them that the conversation had a quality almost of choreography. The specific steps they both knew, each playing their part, neither one fully aware that what looked like a conversation was also a performance of a dynamic that had been running for 20 years without either of them ever stepping back far enough to see its full shape. Sandra paid for Darnell's car repair that April, $1,800 for a vehicle he needed to pursue a new job lead that seemed, this time, genuinely promising. The job lead did not produce a job within the timeline Darnell had described. The car ran. He was grateful. Sandra wrote it on her notepad. The call from Renee about Marcus's deal came on a Sunday evening in late February of 2021. Sandra had been trying to finish a novel she had purchased 4 months earlier and had been reading in 15-minute increments between everything else, and she was closer to the end than she had been in months, and had allowed herself the small luxury of a full evening with it, sitting in her reading chair with a cup of tea and the particular contentment of a woman who is, for once, simply where she is. When her phone rang and the screen showed Renee's name, she set the book down with its spine carefully open to hold the page and answered with genuine warmth, because despite everything, despite the whole long history of what Renee's calls had taught her to expect, she loved her sister and she was always genuinely glad to hear her voice. They talked for nearly 20 minutes about nothing particularly weighted. Their mother, a cousin's new baby, a church event Sandra had missed. The warmth between them was real. It always was. And then Renee arrived at the destination she had been heading towards since she dialed, with the ease of someone who has been building towards something and is finally ready to say it. Marcus had a deal. Commercial property development, a mixed-use project on the outer edge of the Columbus suburbs where new development was pushing outward and land values were moving with it. He had investors lined up. The financing was largely in place, but there was a gap, a bridge gap, Renee said, which was a term she used with the confidence of someone who has heard her husband use it enough times to have absorbed it as her own vocabulary. The gap was $22,000. The deal would close within 60 days, and the money would come back with 8% on top of it. Renee's voice was warm and certain, and carried the particular confidence of a woman who believes completely in what she is saying, because the person she loves has told her it is true, and she has chosen, as she had always chosen, to believe him. Sandra was quiet for a moment after Renee finished. She asked her questions about the other investors, about the property details, about what would happen if the 60-day timeline extended. Renee answered all of them with fluency, the rehearsed fluency of Marcus's information coming through Renee's voice, and Sandra noted the difference between fluency and knowledge without saying so. She told Renee she needed a few days to think about it. Renee said, "Of course, absolutely. Take all the time you need," and Sandra heard beneath the graciousness the faint pressure of a situation that was not, in reality, as flexible as the presentation suggested. She thought about it for 3 days. On the Saturday morning of those 3 days, she went to her garden and crouched in the early spring soil with her gloves on and tried to think clearly, the way she always thought most clearly when her hands were in the ground and the ambient noise of the rest of her life had a chance to quiet. She thought about the roof and Darnell's rent, and the car repair, and the $6,000 in 2012, and the $9,000 in 2007. She thought about the total she had been running in the back of her mind for years without writing it down, the way a person sometimes knows a number without wanting to confirm it by making it visible. She thought about saying no. She sat with that for a long time in the cold spring garden. She thought about what Renee's voice would carry the next time they spoke if she said no. She thought about the particular politeness that would replace the warmth, careful and unchanged on the surface, and quietly different underneath, and how long that politeness would last, and what it would cost both of them while it did. She thought about the deal actually working, the 60 days passing, the money returning, the relief of having said yes to something that came through. She thought about Maya, who was 13 now, and who Sandra had taken shopping for school clothes in September, and who had said, in the car on the way home, with the directness of a teenager who has not yet learned to soften the things she notices, that she wished her dad had an Auntie Sandra. Sandra had laughed and said, "You mean like me?" And Maya had said no, like an Auntie Sandra for him, someone who helped him figure things out. Sandra had been quiet for a moment, and then changed the subject, but she had thought about it afterward, more than once, in the way you think about something a child says, when it lands in a place that was already tender. She opened her laptop on a Monday morning and applied for a home equity line of credit against a house she had spent 20 years paying off and had fully owned for 12 months. She was approved within 48 hours. She wired $22,000 to Renee's account on a Tuesday morning in March of 2021, called Renee to confirm it had arrived, and received the warmth and gratitude that she had learned to receive the way you receive something you know is not quite enough, but is what is being offered. Renee said she and Marcus were so grateful that they knew Sandra was going out on a limb, that they were not going to forget it. Sandra said she knew they wouldn't. She went back to work. She did not tell anyone what she had done or why. She put the confirmation of the wire transfer in the kitchen drawer with her notepad and made dinner and ate it standing at the counter, which had become a habit she had not consciously formed but had noticed herself doing more and more, eating standing up, as though sitting down for a meal required a ceremony of solitude that cost more than it was worth on a weeknight. The 60 days passed. Sandra did not hear from Renee about the deal's progress, which she interpreted as either a good sign, things were moving, no news being good news, or a sign she had learned not to look at too directly. At the 90-day mark, she sent Renee a text, asking casually how things were going. Renee responded that there had been some delays, but Marcus was confident they were close. Sandra wrote nothing back. At 5 months she called, and Renee answered with the particular warmth that Sandra had learned to receive with her guard up. And Renee said the words that Sandra had been waiting for since the moment she wired the money. The words she had known somewhere deep and quiet were coming. The words that arrived not with cruelty, but with the smooth, practiced sorrow of someone who has delivered bad news before and has developed a method for it. The deal had collapsed. A financing partner had withdrawn. Marcus was devastated. They were devastated. It was such a brutal outcome after everyone had worked so hard and believed so completely. Sandra held the phone and listened to Renee's voice moving through the explanation and registered it in the part of her mind that registered things without yet deciding what to do with them. And then Renee said the sentence that Sandra would carry with her for the next 2 years, like a stone she turned over regularly, looking for something underneath it that would make it easier to hold. Renee said, "I knew you would understand, Sandra. You always do." Sandra said she understood. She put the phone down on the kitchen table and sat in her house in the quiet of a Tuesday evening and looked at the wall in front of her for a long time. She understood many things. She understood that $22,000 of her home equity was gone and was not coming back. She understood that the home equity line of credit was now a debt with interest accruing that she was going to be paying for years. She understood that this was the 4th time in 14 years that she had given money to Marcus Webb's ventures and received either nothing or a fraction of it back. What she had not yet understood, what she was still years away from understanding with the full, unsparing clarity that understanding eventually requires, was that she had been running toward a version of this moment for a very long time, and that the path there had been built, stone by stone, from all the times she had said she understood, when what she meant was, "I will absorb this because the alternative is too costly to consider." In 2021, Sandra also paid $8,500 toward her mother's medical expenses. Evelyn had been hospitalized twice that year, once in March and once in September, for complications related to her diabetes that Medicare covered partially and incompletely, leaving gaps that Evelyn's fixed income could not fill. Sandra paid without hesitation, because this one was different. This was her mother. This was actual medical need. This was the woman who had cracked the window when the room felt heavy and who had sat at the family dinner table with her hand over Sandra's when nobody else came. She paid, and she was glad to pay, and she did not put this one in the same mental category as Marcus's deals or Darnell's rent. She put it in its own category, the category of things she would do again without question, which was itself important information about how Sandra's internal accounting worked. Not everything was in the same ledger, not everything was weighed on the same scale, and that complexity made the full picture even harder to see clearly than it would have been if the giving had been uniform. In early 2022, Darnell's legal fees arrived, $6,000, related to a civil dispute that Sandra never received the full details of. Darnell was vague in a way that suggested either embarrassment or a situation he felt was better presented in outline than in specifics. She knew it involved a former landlord and some kind of disputed damages claim, and that without the money for an attorney, Darnell was looking at a judgment against him that would affect his credit and his housing options for years. She paid. She told herself she was not going to ask for the details she had not been given, because asking would mean Darnell knew she had noticed the absence of details, and she was not ready for what that conversation would require from both of them. Later that same year, Sandra did something she had been quietly doing in smaller ways for years, but formalized in 2022, into what she called in her own mind the Family Emergency Fund, a savings account she opened specifically to hold money available for Holloway family crises, to which she contributed $800 a month automatically. Over the 26 months it existed before she closed it, she deposited just over $20,000 into that account. In that same period, she made $11,000 in withdrawals to cover family needs. No one else contributed a single dollar. The account existed because Sandra had created it, was funded because Sandra funded it, and was drawn on because crises continued to arrive at the rate they had always arrived, which was to say, regularly and without advance warning. When she eventually closed it, in the spring of 2024, she did so without explanation to anyone, because no one had ever known it existed. By the end of 2022, Sandra had transferred, withdrawn, lent, gifted, or otherwise redirected $102,000 out of her own accounts and into the lives of her family members across a 13-year period. She had not yet added it up. She was not yet ready to add it up. The number existed, the way things exist before you look at them directly, present, real, and carrying a weight that you can feel even when you are not facing it. She was 56 years old. Her retirement account was at 41% of where it should have been, for her age and her planned retirement timeline. Her home equity line of credit carried an outstanding balance of $26,000. Her savings account held $9,000, down from a peak of $38,000 4 years earlier. She was sleeping 5.5 hours a night on a good night. Her blood pressure medication had been increased twice in 3 years. She was managing all of this. She was managing it the way she had managed everything across her entire adult life, which was to say quietly, competently, without complaint, and without anyone around her having a clear picture of the full cost of the managing. In February of 2023, Sandra sat in the office of her doctor at Mount Carmel Medical Center on the east side of Columbus and heard things she had technically known for some time, but had not allowed to arrive with their full weight. Her blood pressure was dangerously elevated. Not elevated in the way it had been elevated before, the manageable kind that responded to medication adjustments and dietary caution. Elevated in the way that required immediate intervention and a direct conversation about what was causing it, the kind of conversation that her doctor, a measured and thoughtful man named Dr. Okafor, had been building toward for 2 years and was now having, because the numbers on the chart had moved beyond the range where building toward it was still an option. He told her that her body was showing the sustained physiological effects of chronic stress in ways that were measurable and serious. He used the phrase cardiovascular risk profile, and he said it clearly, without softening it, in a way that Sandra registered and then immediately began the process of filing away in the drawer where she filed things she could not address right now. He told her she needed to make changes to her diet, her sleep, her workload, and specifically to the level of ongoing pressure in her daily life. He asked her directly whether she was dealing with significant ongoing stresses. Sandra told him work had been demanding lately. She did not mention the $102,000. She did not mention the home equity line of credit or the retirement account or the 5.5 hours of sleep. She took the prescriptions and the pamphlets and thanked Dr. Okafor with the warm professionalism she had perfected across decades of receiving difficult information and making it seem as though she would address it. She drove home, she made dinner. 2 weeks later, Darnell called about a situation with his lease, and Sandra listened and told herself she would handle her health and this at the same time, because that was what you did when you were Sandra Holloway, and the world kept moving, regardless of what the numbers on a chart said. What changed in the spring and summer of 2023 was not a single moment. It was more like the slow arrival of a clarity that had been forming underground for years, the way water works through stone, invisible, patient, and then suddenly and completely through. Sandra had been reading, in the evenings when she could not sleep, which was most evenings. She had found herself drawn to books about family systems, about caregiving, about the psychology of people who give more than they receive, for so long that the imbalance becomes invisible to them. She was not reading them as self-diagnosis. She told herself she was reading them because the subject was interesting, because she worked in administration, and understanding human systems was professionally useful. But the things she was reading were landing in her body in a way that professional interest alone does not produce. She was reading about parentified children, children who take on adult caregiving responsibilities so early and so consistently that the caregiving becomes identity rather than choice. And she was recognizing something she had not had a name for before. She was reading about financial enmeshment within families, about the way one highly capable, highly responsible family member can become the de facto financial institution for an entire family network, processing other people's emergencies while their own stability erodes in increments too small to constitute a crisis on any given day, and too consistent to be anything else in aggregate. She was reading these things at midnight in her reading chair with a cup of tea that had gone cold, and she was not sleeping, and she was recognizing herself on every page with the particular quality of recognition that is simultaneously a relief and a devastation. On a Saturday morning, in August of 2023, Sandra got up earlier than usual. She made coffee. She carried her laptop and her bank statements going back to 2010 and a yellow legal pad and a pen to the kitchen table, and sat down in the particular quality of morning light that comes through east-facing windows in late summer, warm and slightly gold, the kind of light that makes ordinary rooms look significant. She had been circling this morning for weeks. She opened the first bank statement. She started at the beginning. She went month by month, year by year, writing every transfer, every withdrawal, every wire, every payment that had moved money from her life into someone else's. She worked through the morning without stopping, without softening any number, without categorizing anything as different from anything else. She wrote it all in the same column on the yellow legal pad with the same pen, in her small, precise handwriting, and at 2:37 in the afternoon, she added the column. $112,400. She set the pen down. She looked at the number. She sat with it for a long time in the late afternoon light of her kitchen, which had shifted from gold to something flatter and more ordinary, the way light shifts when the day has moved past its warmest point. $112,000. That was not a number that had been chosen. It was a number that had accumulated in the dark, in the space between all the times she had said she understood and all the times she had said it was nothing, in the gap between what she had told herself she was doing and what the column on the yellow legal pad said she had actually done. She folded the legal pad in half. She put it in the kitchen drawer with the notepad that had been living there for years. She sat for another few minutes in the quiet. Then she picked up her phone and called Evelyn and asked if Sunday the 17th was free. Her mother said yes. Sandra said good. She was calling a family meeting. She spent 2 weeks preparing. She wrote notes on index cards, not a speech but a framework, the organized, professional approach of a woman who had spent 30 years structuring difficult conversations at work and was now applying the same rigor to the most important conversation of her personal life. She was not going to be accusatory. She was not going to present the number as an indictment or herself as a victim. She was going to be clear and honest in the way she had always been at her best, and she was going to ask for something she had never asked for from her family in her adult life: acknowledgement, not repayment. She had made peace with the reality that most of the money was gone. Not apology, not necessarily, not yet. Just acknowledgement. She wanted the people she had spent her life holding up to see her clearly, once, with the full picture in front of them. She wanted them to know what she had done, and what it had cost, and that things needed to be different going forward. She thought this was not too much to ask. She had never asked for anything before. She called each family member personally to invite them. Evelyn first, who said of course she would be there, said it with the warmth of someone who already knew, in the way mothers know things, that something important was happening. Darnell second, who said, "Yeah, of course. What's going on?" And Sandra said she just needed the whole family together to talk about some things. And Darnell said, "Sure, sure," with the easy casualness of a man who is already half paying attention to something else. Renee said she would check with Marcus, and called back the next day to say they would both be there. Marcus did not personally confirm. Sandra cooked for 2 days beforehand. She made pot roast from her mother's recipe, the one that required starting the day before, and that she had not made in years, because it was a recipe for a full table, and she rarely had a full table. Cornbread from scratch. Green beans from her garden that she had put up over the summer in mason jars, the way Evelyn had taught her when she was a teenager, standing at that same stove on Livingston Avenue. Sweet potato pie, because she had always brought sweet potato pie to family gatherings, and she was not going to stop now, was not going to let the weight of what she needed to say change the fact that she was still, underneath everything, the woman who showed up with food. She cleaned the house thoroughly, the way she cleaned when she was nervous about something and needed to do something with her hands. She set the table with the white and blue china she had bought herself at an estate sale a decade earlier and used only for occasions that felt like they deserved ceremony, because this one did. She lit a candle on the table. She checked the time. She sat down and waited. Evelyn arrived 20 minutes early, riding with a neighbor from church because she no longer drove, coming through the front door, with her purse held in both hands, and her eyes moving quickly around the room in the way of a woman who is reading a situation and reading it accurately. She looked at the table and the candles and the good china, and she looked at Sandra, and she said, quietly, "This is beautiful, baby." Sandra said, "Thank you, Mama." They sat together in the living room and talked while they waited, about the neighborhood and the church, and a garden issue Evelyn was having with something eating her tomatoes, and Sandra was present in the conversation, and also slightly removed from it, the way you are when you are listening with one ear to a door you are expecting to open. The time came. They moved to the table. The food was warm, and the candle was lit, and there were 5 place settings on the white and blue china, and the house smelled the way the Livingston Avenue house had smelled on the best Sunday afternoons of Sandra's childhood, of pot roast and cornbread, and the specific warmth of a family meal that everyone was present for, except that not everyone was present. At 43 minutes past the time Sandra had asked everyone to arrive, Darnell's text came through. Something had come up. He was so sorry. He would call tomorrow. Sandra read the text once. She set her phone face down on the table beside her plate. She looked at the empty chair where Darnell should have been sitting. She looked at the chair beside it where Renee should have been sitting, and the one beyond it where Marcus should have been. Renee had not texted. Renee had not called. The chairs were simply empty, the way chairs are empty when the people who were supposed to sit in them made other choices. Sandra looked at her mother across the table. Evelyn looked back at her, with an expression that Sandra had never seen on her mother's face before, and would not forget. Not pity exactly, and not just sorrow, but something that recognized the full weight of the moment without trying to minimize it. The face of a woman who sees clearly what has happened and does not have the capacity to fix it, and knows that Sandra knows both of those things. Sandra picked up the serving spoon and served her mother's plate. Then she served her own. They ate together, the 2 of them, at a table set for 5, with the good china and the candle burning in the center, and the pot roast that Sandra had started the day before still warm. And the 3 empty chairs were simply there, the way the truth is simply there when you have finally stopped moving fast enough to avoid it. They talked. Not about the meeting that hadn't happened. Not directly. Evelyn was wise enough to know that going directly at it would only make it harder for Sandra to stay composed. And Sandra was the kind of woman who needed to stay composed almost as much as she needed to be seen. They talked about other things, smaller things, things that still connected them to the ordinary life of this family, the one that existed alongside the difficult one, the one made of church and recipes and the neighbor's dog, and the way the light came through Evelyn's kitchen windows in the early morning. And at some point in the middle of this conversation, while Sandra was clearing the first course and bringing the sweet potato pie to the table, Evelyn reached across and put her hand over Sandra's on the edge of the table and held it there without speaking. Just held it. Sandra looked down at her mother's hand, the fingers still slightly swollen at the joints from the arthritis that had been working through them for 50 years, and she felt something move through her chest that she did not try to name or manage or file away. She let it move. She did not cry. She covered her mother's hand with her free hand, and they sat like that for a moment, the two of them, at a table set for 5, in a house that smelled of a meal prepared for a gathering that had not gathered, and it was the most Sandra had been held in years, and it was a hand on a table, and it was everything. She washed all 5 sets of dishes that night. She stood at the kitchen sink after Evelyn's neighbor came to collect her, and she washed and dried every plate and glass and piece of silverware with the careful thoroughness she brought to all physical tasks, and she put everything back in the cabinet exactly where it belonged, and she closed the cabinet door and stood in her clean, quiet kitchen at 10:45 at night and looked at the closed cabinet for a moment. Then she went to bed. She did not hear from Renee until the following morning, a call that Renee opened with the warmth that had always been Renee's default register for difficult conversations, the rehearsed warmth that Sandra had spent years receiving and had spent the last several months learning to see more clearly for what it was. Renee said she had heard from Darnell that Sandra had called some kind of family meeting, and she just wanted Sandra to know that she and Marcus hadn't come because they had not wanted to be part of any drama. She used the word drama 3 times in the conversation. Sandra listened to each use of it and felt something in her chest that was not grief and was not anger, but was something cooler and more final than either of those. The feeling of a door that has been left open for a long time, quietly and definitively swinging toward its frame. She did not close it. She was not ready to close it, and she was not sure she would ever be ready to close it entirely, because closing it entirely would mean something she had not yet decided she was willing to accept. But she felt it swing. She felt it swing, and she held the phone, and she said, "I hear you, Renee," and she got off the call, and she stood in her kitchen on a Monday morning, with her coffee going cold on the counter, and the yellow legal pad in the drawer, and $112,000 in a column, and the memory of 2 hands on a table, and she made a decision that was not dramatic and did not announce itself, and that she would only understand the full significance of much later. She decided that she was going to stop managing this alone. She was going to stop carrying the weight of seeing it clearly, in complete isolation. She was going to tell someone. She did not yet know who that person would be. She would find out in November, at 2:12 in the morning, in a hospital room, when Gloria Washington walked through the door with sunflowers. The weeks between the family meeting and November moved with the particular, deceptive ordinariness of a life that is deteriorating beneath a surface that still looks managed. Sandra went to work. She attended her church on Sundays. She tended her garden through the last weeks of the growing season, pulling the spent tomato plants in October with the methodical finality of someone closing down something that had been alive and is now not, covering the beds for winter with the patient attention of someone who still believes in the next season. She was not sleeping. She was not eating regularly. She was experiencing headaches that she attributed to screen time and the persistent stress of a demanding work schedule, and the after effects of the family meeting, and the accumulation of things she was still processing. She went to a follow-up appointment with Dr. Okafor in late October, and he adjusted her blood pressure medication for the second time in 14 months. And he said the word stress again, with the directness of someone who has been saying a word for long enough that he is now saying it more loudly. Sandra nodded. She took the new prescription. She drove home and found a voicemail from Darnell. Not about money this time, just checking in. And she listened to it twice and called him back, and they talked for 20 minutes about nothing in particular, and it was good. It was genuinely good, the way things between them could still be good in the spaces between the other things. and she was glad she had called him back. November 14th, 2023, was a Wednesday. Sandra had worked a full day, driven home in the early dark of a mid-November evening, eaten a small dinner at her kitchen counter, because she had been eating at the counter more and more, and had not yet decided to address that habit, and watched the first 40 minutes of a documentary she had been meaning to finish for 3 weeks. She went to bed at 10:30. She was asleep within minutes, the deep, immediate unconsciousness of a body that has been running beyond its capacity for long enough that sleep, when it comes, arrives like a door that closes hard and fast. She woke
What's
at 2:12
happening
in
to
the morning.
me?
The pressure in her chest was there before she was fully conscious of being awake, the way serious physical events sometimes arrive before the waking mind has organized itself around them, before you have the language for what is happening, or the perspective to assess it. It was not sharp. It was heavy, the specific heaviness of something pressing down from inside, a weight behind the sternum that radiated outward into her left arm in a way that she had enough medical literacy to recognize and enough habitual minimizing to spend several seconds attempting to explain away. She shifted position. She breathed slowly. The heaviness did not lift, and then the dizziness arrived, sudden, violent, the room tilting in a way that made her grip the edge of the mattress with both hands when she tried to sit up, the world physically rearranging itself in a way that the body understands as danger before the mind catches up. She reached for her phone on the nightstand. Her hands were shaking with a fine, rapid tremor that she could not control and that frightened her more than the chest pressure, because the chest pressure she had been explaining away, and the hands would not be explained away. She opened her contacts. She pressed Darnell's name. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. His recorded voice was cheerful, the easy cheerfulness of a message recorded on a good day, and the distance between that cheerfulness and the room she was lying in at 2:12 in the morning was so vast that Sandra felt it as a physical distance, something she would have had to cross to reach him, that she could not cross from here. She pressed call again. Voicemail again. She found Renee's number. It rang 7 times before the voicemail message played. 7 distinct rings that Sandra counted in the dark, without meaning to count, each one adding something to an accounting she was not yet ready to complete. She found Marcus's number. It went directly to voicemail without ringing at all, which meant either his phone was off or she had been declined. And in that specific moment, lying in the dark, with her hands shaking and her chest heavy, and the room that would not hold still, the distinction between those 2 possibilities did not seem to matter very much. She lay in the dark for a moment that she would later describe as the longest and the most clarifying of her life. Not because she was unafraid. She was afraid, genuinely and physically afraid, in the way the body is afraid when it is telling you something true and urgent about itself. But beneath the fear, running alongside it in a register she had not anticipated, was a clarity that had the quality of something long prepared, like a sentence that has been forming for years and has finally, in this moment, arrived complete. She had given 30 years to these people. She had given everything she had, and much that she did not have. And on the night that she needed them, in the most basic and literal and irreducible sense of the word need, she was alone in this house. Completely alone. The phones had rung, and the phones had gone to voicemail, and there was nobody coming. She pressed 911. The dispatcher's name was Kevin, and he had a steady, calm voice that met her exactly where she was, without making her feel worse for being there. She unlocked her front door so the paramedics could enter without her having to get up again. She went back to her bed and lay down and kept Kevin's voice in her ear and looked at the ceiling of her bedroom, the ceiling she had looked at on 10,000 ordinary nights, and she waited. The paramedics arrived in 8 minutes. In the 22 minutes between waking and their arrival, Sandra Holloway lay alone in the house she had paid off 2 years ahead of schedule, the house she had put on the line for a business venture that failed, surrounded by the accumulated evidence of a life spent in service of other people, and she waited for strangers to come and save her, because the people she had saved repeatedly across 3 decades had not picked up their phones. She was admitted to the Columbus Hospital's cardiac unit and kept for 4 days. The event was a serious cardiac arrhythmia, her heart's electrical system misfiring in response to blood pressure that had been dangerously elevated for longer than the October appointment had fully captured, combined with the physiological effects of sustained, chronic stress on a cardiovascular system that had been carrying more than its designed load for many years. Her cardiologist, a precise and unhurried woman named Dr. Reeves, was direct with her, in the way that good doctors are direct when they need the patient to understand that this was not a warning that could be filed away. She said that had Sandra waited another 30 minutes to call for help, the outcome of the night could have been substantially and permanently different. Sandra received this information with the composure she brought to all difficult information, and then lay back against the pillow and looked at the ceiling of the hospital room and let it land properly for the first time. Let it be the thing it actually was, rather than the thing she was capable of managing, and it was several minutes before she was ready to speak again. Evelyn came on the second day, arriving with a neighbor from church at the same time Sandra's lunch tray was being delivered. Coming through the hospital room door, with her purse held in both hands, and her face doing the thing it had done the night Robert died. The face of a woman who sees clearly and has no way to fix what she sees. She sat in the chair beside the bed, and she held Sandra's hand, and she did not say very much for a long time, and Sandra did not need her to. The presence was what mattered. The warm, consistent, undemanding presence of her mother sitting beside her without needing anything, without a request waiting at the end of the visit, simply there, in the way that Evelyn, whatever her limitations, and whatever the complexity of her relationship to what had happened to Sandra over the years, had always ultimately been there when it was most essential. Sandra held her mother's hand and looked at the ceiling and felt the particular relief of being in the presence of someone who is not going to ask for anything. It was, she realized, a feeling she had very rarely experienced in her adult life. She let herself stay in it. Darnell arrived on the third afternoon. He had driven 40 minutes in afternoon traffic, and Sandra registered the effort of that, gave it its proper weight, because she had always been scrupulous about giving weight to the genuine efforts people made, even when those efforts were surrounded by other things that were harder to give weight to. He was visibly shaken by the sight of her in the hospital bed, in a way that she found, despite everything, touching. His face, when he came through the door, had a rawness to it that she recognized as unperformed. The fear of a man who loves his sister and has just understood in a new and concrete way that his sister is mortal. They talked. He asked about the doctors and the prognosis and what she needed when she got home, and he was present and attentive in a way that felt real. And then, with perhaps 40 minutes left in his visit, his voice shifted into the register she knew, the one that always preceded the asking, and he said he didn't want to bring something up right now, but that there was a situation developing with his apartment lease that he was hoping she might be willing to talk about when she was feeling better. He brought this up in a room where Sandra had cardiac monitors attached to her chest. He brought it up in the 43rd minute of a hospital visit to a woman who had been admitted 2 days earlier with a cardiac event. He brought it up, not because he was malicious, but because the habit of bringing it to Sandra was so deeply ingrained in the architecture of their relationship that even a hospital room was not sufficient friction to interrupt it. Sandra looked at him for a moment. She said she was not in a position to talk about that right now. He said, of course, and she could see the shame moving across his face, real and unguarded. The shame of a man who knows immediately upon doing something that he should not have done it. He changed the subject. He stayed for another 20 minutes. He hugged her carefully when he left, and she held on for a moment. And she meant it, because this was Darnell, and she loved him, and those two things were still true regardless of everything. She watched him walk out of the room and listened to his footsteps moving away down the corridor, and then there was only the sound of the cardiac monitors and the distant ordinary sounds of a hospital, and she looked at Renee's carnations on the windowsill, still drooping in their plastic grocery store wrapping, and she felt the full shape of what she was living inside clearly and without softening for the first time. Felt it the way you feel a room's dimensions in the dark by walking its perimeter, and the shape was what it had always been. She had been alone in this for a long time. She had just not, until now, been forced by circumstances to see it from the outside. Renee did not come. She sent the carnations on the first day through a grocery store delivery service, yellow and white in their plastic cellophane, the card a printed get well message, with Renee and Marcus, handwritten at the bottom, in what appeared to be Renee's handwriting. Sandra looked at the carnations for a long time on the first afternoon. She thought about the $22,000. She thought about the 7 rings before the voicemail at 2:12 in the morning. She thought about the word drama, said 3 times on a Monday morning call, used to describe a family meeting at which Sandra had been prepared to show her family, for the first time in her adult life, the full and honest cost of loving them. She reached over and moved the carnations to the windowsill, where she did not have to look at them directly, and turned on the television and watched the news until she was tired enough to sleep. On the 4th day, the day before her discharge, Sandra lay in the hospital bed, in the particular quiet of a late afternoon, when visiting hours had ended and the ward had settled into its evening rhythm, and she thought. She did not try to plan, or solve, or manage. She simply thought, in the open, unobstructed way that becomes possible when you are in a place where nobody needs anything from you, and your phone is on the nightstand, and you have not picked it up in hours. She thought about the notebook in her kitchen drawer. She thought about the yellow legal pad. She thought about Dr. Okafor saying the word stress in an increasingly loud voice for 2 years, and Sandra nodding, and filing it in the drawer, where she filed things she could not address right now. She thought about the green and white house on Livingston Avenue, and a Saturday morning in 1974, and a glass of water. She thought about Darnell's hand wrapped around her index finger in the summer of 1976, and about Maya in the car in September saying she wished her dad had an Auntie Sandra, and about the man named James who had said he felt like he was always waiting in line behind everyone else in her life. She thought about the 5 sets of good china she had washed and dried alone. She thought about her mother's hand on top of hers at the table that was set for 5. She lay in the hospital bed and thought about all of it, without trying to organize it into something manageable. Just let it be what it was, the full and complicated and costly and loving and exhausted truth of her life. And at some point in the middle of all of that thinking, something shifted. Not dramatically, not in the way of a decision that announces itself, more like the moment in the morning when you realize the light has changed, and you cannot say exactly when it changed, but you can see clearly that it has, and that the day is a different thing now than it was a few minutes ago. She was not going to keep doing this the same way. She did not know yet what the different way looked like, but she knew, with the quiet and unargued certainty of the body, rather than the mind, that the different way was the only way she had left. Gloria Washington arrived on the 2nd afternoon of Sandra's hospitalization, not the 3rd or 4th, not after Sandra had asked her to come. Sandra had not asked anyone to come, which was itself a data point that Gloria had registered and acted on. Gloria was 53 years old, Sandra's colleague of 11 years at the Columbus City School District, a woman of quiet steadiness and a kind of attentiveness that most people in their professional relationship did not fully appreciate because it was not loud and did not perform itself. She had been watching Sandra across 11 years of lunches and hallway conversations and the small daily exchanges of people who work alongside each other, long enough to know more than they have been explicitly told. She had watched the way Sandra's face tightened when her phone rang at lunch, the specific tightening of someone bracing for information rather than welcoming contact. She had noticed the way Sandra's energy at the start of weekends was different from her energy at the end of them, that she returned from holidays and family gatherings wearing a specific kind of tiredness that was not about activity, but about something more interior. She had observed, over years, the practiced ease with which Sandra deflected personal questions, the smoothness of the transition from anything that approached the personal to safer, more general territory, a smoothness so accomplished that you would miss it entirely if you were not paying close attention. Gloria had been paying close attention. She did not know the details. She did not know about the legal pad, or the $112,000, or the home equity line of credit. She knew what you know about a person after 11 years of looking carefully, which is the shape of something even when you cannot see all the way around it. When she heard from a mutual colleague that Sandra had been hospitalized, she did not text. She did not look up the hospital's delivery service for flowers. She drove to the hospital on a Tuesday afternoon with sunflowers from an actual florist on 5th Avenue in Columbus, the tall kind, with the dark centers that look like small suns, the kind that are completely different in their specific cheerfulness and vitality from carnations in plastic grocery store wrapping. and she knocked on Sandra's open hospital room door and stood in the doorway and said simply, "I am here." Sandra turned from the television she had not been watching and looked at Gloria standing in the doorway with the sunflowers, and something happened in Sandra's face that Gloria would describe later as the moment when a person who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time is finally given permission to set it down. Sandra cried. Not
I
quietly,
can't do
not
this.
with the composed
It's
management
okay.
of
I'm
emotion
here.
she had been
It
performing her
hurts so
entire
much.
adult
I know I'm
life.
here.
She cried in the real way, the full way, the way that means the thing being released has been held for long enough that its release cannot be graceful. Gloria came into the room and set the sunflowers on the windowsill and pulled the chair close to the bed and sat down and did not say anything while Sandra cried, because there was nothing to say in that moment that would be more useful than simply staying. When the crying finished, Gloria stayed. She stayed for 5 hours. She did not perform comfort, she provided it, which is a different thing in the same way that describing a painting is different from standing in front of it. She did not try to reframe or minimize or reassure Sandra that everything was going to be fine, because she did not know whether everything was going to be fine, and she was wise enough to know that false reassurance from a genuinely difficult situation is its own form of abandonment. She asked questions, careful, unhurried questions that were really just invitations to continue, that signaled without stating, "I am here, I am not going anywhere, and whatever you say will be received." Sandra talked. She told Gloria about the roof in 2019, and Darnell's rent and the car repair. She told her about the 6,000 in 2012, and the 9,000 in 2007, and the 22,000 in 2021. She told her about the home equity line of credit on a house she had spent 20 years paying off. She told her about the yellow legal pad and the number at the bottom of the column. She told her about the family meeting and Darnell's text at 43 minutes past, and Renee's word drama said 3 times on a Monday morning, and Marcus, who had never responded to the invitation at all. She told her about the 7 rings at 2:12 in the morning, and the hands that were shaking, and the carnations that had been drooping since the first afternoon on the windowsill. She had never said any of it out loud to another human being. Not one word of the accounting, not one piece of the full picture. She had been carrying it in complete isolation since the first entry in the column, and the experience of setting it down into another person's hearing, of being genuinely listened to by someone with no stake in the story, no version of it to protect, no guilt to manage through the receiving, was something Sandra had not known she was starving for until the food arrived. Gloria was quiet when Sandra finished, not the uncomfortable quiet of someone who does not know what to say, but the settled quiet of someone who is making sure the other person is fully done before responding, who understands that a pause is also a form of listening. And then she said the 2 sentences that Sandra would carry forward from this room into everything that came after. The 2 sentences she would repeat in her own mind on the hard days of the year ahead, when the old habits pulled at her, and the old guilt arrived, and the new life she was trying to build felt more like a decision than a reality. Gloria said, "What they did with your love was their failure, not yours. But what you do next, that part is yours to choose." Sandra looked at the ceiling. She looked at the sunflowers on the windowsill, vivid and alive in a way that the carnations had never been. And she looked back at Gloria, and she did not say anything. She lay back against the pillow and held those 2 sentences in her chest and felt them doing the work that true things do when they arrive at exactly the right moment, which is not the work of revelation, she had known these things somewhere, but the work of permission. She had been given permission, for the first time in her adult life, by a person who had no obligation to give it and gave it anyway. Sandra Holloway had been given permission to choose what came next. She was discharged on a Saturday morning. Gloria drove her home, helped carry her bag inside, made tea in Sandra's
Here you
kitchen
go, dear.
with the easy
Thank you.
familiarity
I
of
feel
someone
awful.
who has
You're
decided
welcome.
that
Just
being
rest.
useful in
This
small
helps.
ways is one of the most honest forms of care available. She stayed for 2 hours. She came back the next day, and the day after. Not every day. Gloria had her own life, and was not trying to become Sandra's caretaker, which was its own form of grace, given the specific nature of what Sandra was recovering from. She came with the irregular, reliable warmth of someone who has decided that showing up is important and is doing it without fanfare and without keeping score, which was, Sandra slowly began to understand, the thing she had been doing for her family her entire life, and the thing her family had almost never done in return. In January of 2024, Gloria connected Sandra with Patricia Osei, a certified financial planner who had built her practice specifically around working with women in midlife financial recovery, women who had arrived at their 50s with significantly less financial security than their earning history and intelligence should have produced, through a variety of circumstances that her practice had seen enough times to have developed a language for. Patricia was 50 years old, composed and direct, and possessed of the particular gift of receiving difficult financial realities without either minimizing them or performing shock, which was exactly what Sandra needed from a person she was about to tell everything to. They met in Patricia's office, in a building on the north side of Columbus, on a Tuesday afternoon in January, and Sandra sat down across from her and laid the full picture out with the organized precision she brought to professional presentations. The yellow legal pad and the bank statements and the home equity documents and the retirement account statements, and Patricia received it the way a doctor receives a complicated patient history, with complete attention and without judgment, and with the specific quality of focus that means the information is being taken seriously enough to work with. Patricia told Sandra 2 things at the end of that first meeting that Sandra wrote in her phone immediately so that she would not lose them. The first was, "You are not starting over, you are starting from somewhere." The second was, "The most important financial decision you will make from this point forward is deciding who has access to your resources." Those 2 sentences would function for the following year as the framework that Sandra returned to when the old habits pulled hardest, when the phone rang and the familiar voice on the other end was asking for something, and the old reflexive language of course, and I'll figure it out, began forming in her throat before she had consciously decided to say it. You are starting from somewhere. Who has access to your resources? She said them to herself on a Thursday evening in January, when Darnell called, and she let it go to voicemail, and stood in her kitchen with her hands still, for the first time after one of his calls, in as long as she could clearly remember. She listened to the message. It was about his lease, as she had expected. She texted back 3 sentences. "I love you, Darnell. I cannot help with this right now. Take care of yourself." She set the phone down on the counter and stood in her quiet kitchen and waited for the pulling sensation, the old guilt, the feeling she had always experienced after saying no, that her body had learned to interpret as endangerment. It came. It was real, and it was unpleasant, and it did not move her. She made dinner. She sat down for it, at the table, with a proper plate. She ate it without looking at her phone. The first time was the hardest. The second time, in March, when Darnell called again about a different situation, and Sandra let it go to voicemail again, and texted back the same essential message in different words, it was hard, in a way that was slightly different from the first hard, still real, still costly, but with a faint and growing sense beneath it that she was doing something true. The third time was hard in yet another way, and the fourth time was hard, and she understood by then that it was going to be hard for a long time, possibly always, that the muscle of the new pattern was not going to suddenly become stronger than the muscle of the 30-year-old pattern, that what she was working toward was not the absence of difficulty, but the ability to move through the difficulty without being governed by it. That was the work. It was not dramatic work. It did not look like anything from the outside. It looked like a woman not picking up her phone and then making dinner and then sitting down to eat it. But it was the most significant work Sandra Holloway had done in her adult life, and she knew it, and she did it. Renee called in February of 2024. She did not call to acknowledge what had happened in November. She did not call to name the hospital night, or the 7 rings, or the family meeting, or the $22,000. She called to ask whether Sandra was still upset, and whether they could just move past it, whether they could just be sisters again, whether this distance between them had to continue, because she missed Sandra, and she knew things had been difficult, and she genuinely wanted things to be okay between them. Sandra listened to all of this. She heard the real feeling in it. Renee did miss her, that was true, and the love was real, that was also true, and none of that changed the other things that were also true. She wrote a text response that she revised 4 times before sending. The final version said, "I love you. I am not ready yet. I will reach out when I am." She sent it and put the phone down, and noticed that her hands were steady. She did not hear back from Renee for 6 weeks, and when Renee did write back it was a single line, "I'm here when you're ready." Sandra saved that text. She did not know yet what it meant for the future of their relationship. She was not yet ready to decide. But the door was cracked, and she had cracked it intentionally, because she understood something about herself that the year had clarified. She was not a woman who closed doors permanently, because closing them permanently would require becoming someone she did not want to be, and she had already given enough of herself to this family. She was not going to give them her capacity for love as well. In the spring of 2024, Darnell called on an ordinary Tuesday evening and talked for 45 minutes without asking for anything. They talked about Maya, who had started high school and was doing well, who had joined the school newspaper and written a piece about her neighborhood that her teacher had entered in a regional competition. They talked about their mother, whose health was relatively stable and who had recently started attending a chair exercise class at the community center that she described as ridiculous but attended every week without fail. They talked about a Columbus Blue Jackets game that Darnell had watched, and about a documentary Sandra had been watching, and about a restaurant on High Street that had been there for 30 years and had recently closed. Near the end of the call, in a pause that had a different quality from the rest of the conversation, a deliberate quality, the quality of someone who has been building toward something and has arrived at it, Darnell said, "I know I put a lot on you, Sandra. I know I did. I don't think I ever really looked at it straight until lately, but I've been looking at it, and I'm sorry." Sandra was quiet for a moment. She heard the realness of it, the absence of the rehearsed quality that characterized the apologies people offer when they want to move past something, rather than actually account for it. She heard a man who had been sitting with something and had arrived, on the other side of the sitting, at something that cost him to say. She said, "I know you are, Darnell, and I love you, but we have to be different going forward." He said, "I know." They stayed on the line for a few more minutes without talking about anything in particular, and then said goodnight, and Sandra set the phone down and sat in her kitchen in the quiet of a spring evening, and felt something she could not name precisely, but that had the quality of a long, specific tension beginning, very slowly, to ease. Patricia had told her in January that the financial recovery would take a decade of discipline and patience, that she was not going to recapture what had been lost quickly, that the rebuilding was going to require the same quality of sustained, undramatic commitment that she had brought to paying off her house ahead of schedule 20 years earlier. Sandra had understood and had accepted this in the way she accepted things that were difficult but true, clearly and without complaint, and without pretending they were other than they were. She set up the repayment structure for the home equity line. She maximized her retirement contributions. She stopped the automatic transfers she had been making for years to various accounts that existed primarily to have something available for family needs. She worked with Patricia month by month, quarter by quarter, building slowly and without shortcuts back toward the retirement she had been planning since her 30s and had been quietly dismantling since 2009. It was not glamorous work. There were months when the progress was barely measurable, and the distance between where she was and where she needed to be was a number that required some deliberate effort not to despair over. She did not despair over it. She had spent 30 years managing difficult things quietly and without drama, and that capacity, which had cost her so much in the service of other people's needs, was now available to her in the service of her own. In January of 2024, after 11 years of eating lunch with Sandra in the school district break room and watching her carefully and worrying about her quietly, and eventually driving to a hospital with sunflowers, Gloria told Sandra that she was proud of her, not in the performative way, not as encouragement toward a specific action, but in the direct and simple way of a woman speaking plain truth to someone she has decided to love properly. She said, "I have been watching you for 11 years, and I have never once seen you choose yourself first, and I am proud of you for doing it now." Sandra received this the way she was learning to receive things, without immediately deflecting it back, or minimizing it, or turning it into something smaller and more manageable. She let it land. She said thank you. She looked across the lunch table at this woman who had driven to a hospital with sunflowers and stayed for 5 hours, and come back the next day and the day after, This woman who had no obligation to show up and had shown up anyway, and she felt something she could not immediately articulate, but that she would think about later and recognize as one of the most important realizations of the year, that what she had been looking for her entire life, in the family that had taken and taken without adequate return, was something that was available. That love which gave and received in some approximate balance, love that showed up without being asked, and stayed without needing to be kept, love that offered sunflowers when carnations had been the gesture, that this was real, and that she had not been wrong to want it. She had simply been looking for it in a place that could not give it, for reasons that were complicated and human, and ultimately not a verdict on whether it existed. She booked the New Orleans trip in January of 2024. 7 days, alone, a hotel near the French Quarter, a return ticket for the following Thursday. She had been telling herself she would go to New Orleans since she was in her 20s. She had cut a photograph of the French Quarter out of a travel magazine once and put it on her refrigerator, where it had stayed for 2 years, until a kitchen cleaning moved it, and she had told herself someday. Someday had been deferred roughly 100 times across 3 decades for reasons that ranged from money to scheduling to the quiet, practiced self-erasure of a woman who had learned that her desires were the most flexible item on the family's collective agenda. She booked it on a Wednesday afternoon in January and sat for a moment after clicking confirm, looking at the confirmation email on her screen, and felt a feeling she needed to sit with for a moment before she could identify it. The feeling was that she had done something real, not significant in the world's terms, not a decision that would make news or change anyone else's life, just real, in the specific sense of a woman who had spent her entire adult life organized around other people's needs, taking a concrete, booked, confirmed action in the direction of her own. She landed in New Orleans on a Thursday morning in March and stepped out into air that hit her immediately, the way New Orleans hits people who arrive in it open to being hit. The smell of it, a layering of jasmine and chicory coffee and river water, and something that has no clean name, something old and alive and complicated that lives in the streets themselves, in the soil, in the way the city's history is present in its present, in a way that most American cities have lost or buried. She took a cab to her hotel and put her bag on the bed and went to the window and looked out at a courtyard with an iron gate and a small fountain and bougainvillea climbing the wall in full purple bloom, and she stood there for a long time. The first day she walked, she had no agenda. She moved through the French Quarter in the morning, and through the Marigny in the afternoon, and through Tremé in the early evening, through neighborhoods that felt layered and complicated and deeply inhabited in the way of places that have survived catastrophe and rebuilt themselves more than once, and carry the texture of that surviving in their streets and their music, and the way people move through them. She did not check her phone for 4 hours, and noticed this with the kind of satisfaction that belongs specifically to people who have been checking their phone reflexively for decades, and have suddenly, temporarily, been relieved of the habit. There was nobody calling who needed something. There was nothing she was supposed to be managing from here. She was simply walking in a city that had never asked anything of her, and the particular relief of that, the relief of being in a place that had no claim on her, no history with her, no expectation of her, was something she had not known she needed until she was inside it. On the second day she slept until 9 in the morning. She lay in bed for another 20 minutes after waking, testing something she had been curious about since she booked the trip. Whether the guilt would arrive, the old reflexive guilt of a woman who has been productive since childhood and has internalized rest as a form of failure that must be justified before it can be taken. The guilt came softly, without conviction, like an old habit that has been disrupted enough times to have lost its authority. She looked at it, acknowledged it, and got up and went for coffee and beignets at Café du Monde, and sat at an outside table in the morning light, with the Mississippi just visible across the street, and ate 3 beignets, without counting them or thinking about them in any nutritional context, and was covered in powdered sugar by the end, and did not care, even slightly. She bought herself a small ceramic plate at a shop on Royal Street because she liked it, for no other reason. She ate dinner alone at a table outside a restaurant on Magazine Street and ordered what she wanted, and had a glass of wine, and watched the evening street traffic, and did not look at her phone once during the meal. On the fifth day, she went to a jazz club on Frenchman Street. It was a Tuesday night, and the band was a quartet: piano, bass, trumpet, and drums, playing in a way that moved between the formal structures of jazz standards and something more personal and uncontained. A music that seemed to be coming from somewhere interior rather than being performed for an audience. Sandra sat at a small table in the back with a glass of bourbon and listened. The trumpet player was a young woman, maybe 30, who played with her whole body in a kind of total physical conversation with the music, bending into it and pulling back from it and leaning forward again. And Sandra watched her and felt something building in her chest that had nothing to do with arrhythmia and everything to do with the feeling of being alive in a full-bodied, present, unapologetic way that she had been moving away from for so long she had almost forgotten what it felt like to be moving toward it. She cried. Not dramatically, not in a way that anyone in the club would have noticed, just a quiet, steady release, the way a container releases what it has been holding when you finally remove the lid. Not a flood, but a flow, natural and unhurried and long overdue. She cried for a few minutes and then she didn't, and the music kept going, and she stayed for the whole set. She sent Gloria a photograph from the back of that room, slightly blurry from the low light, the band visible behind her, a glass on the table, Sandra's face with the traces of dried tears, and the expression of someone who has just come through something, and is still inside the coming through of it, and is beginning, for the first time in a long time, to feel something approaching arrival. Gloria's response came within minutes. 3 words. There she is. Sandra read those 3 words twice. She put the phone face down on the table. She ordered another bourbon. She stayed. She came home from New Orleans on a Thursday afternoon and unlocked her front door and stepped into the familiar quiet of her house. The house smelled of the sandalwood wax, warmer she had left running in the living room, a scent she had bought for herself in December, and that had become, over the winter, the smell she associated with the version of her life she was working to build. Quieter, more deliberate, more specifically hers. She put her bag down. She went to the kitchen and made tea, and sat at the table and looked out at her garden, still bare in the early spring, the tomato stakes still standing from last summer like markers of something that had been alive and would be alive again. She thought about the growing season. She thought about what she was going to plant. She thought about Patricia and the repayment plan and the retirement account and the slow, unglamorous, essential work of rebuilding. She thought about Gloria, who had texted that morning asking if she needed a ride from the airport, and Sandra had said no, I have it, and had meant it in more than one sense. She thought about her mother, who called twice a week now, and whose calls Sandra took with a different quality of attention than she once had, more present and less preoccupied, more willing to be simply in the conversation. She thought about Darnell, about the Tuesday call and the 45 minutes, and I know I put a lot on you, Sandra, and the realness of it. She thought about Renee, about the cracked door and the I am here when you're ready, about the long work of that particular relationship that was still ahead, and that she would approach when she was ready, and not before, on her terms and in her time. She thought about Maya, who was in high school now and had written about her neighborhood and might or might not be winning a competition, and about whom Sandra intended to call this week, just to say hello, just to say, I am thinking of you, not because anyone needed anything, but because the love was real and had always been real and was not going anywhere. She finished her tea. She carried the cup to the sink and washed it and set it in the drying rack. She went to her coat closet and took out her gardening gloves, the ones with the green stripes at the wrists that she had owned for 6 years and that fit her hands exactly. She went out the back door into the cold, bare garden. She crouched down in the space between the tomato stakes and pulled on her gloves and drove her fingers into the soil, which was cold and dark and dense with the compressed patience of a ground that has been through a winter and is waiting for the permission of warmth to begin again. She worked for an hour. She turned the soil between the beds and cleared the debris from the edges and did the small, purposeful, preparatory work of a gardener who understands that the growing season begins not with the first planting, but with everything that makes the planting possible. When it got too cold to stay, she went inside. She made soup from a recipe she had been meaning to try for months. She ate it at the table, properly, with a spoon and a cloth napkin and a glass of water, in her own house, in her own kitchen, on a Thursday evening in March, and the phone did not ring once during the entire meal. The silence was not the silence of absence. It was the silence of a woman who had, for the first time in a very long time, enough space to hear herself think. And what she thought, sitting there in the quiet, with the soup and the cloth napkin, and the garden outside the window still bare but ready, was something simple and enormous and long in arriving. She thought, I am still here, after everything, after all of it, after 30 years of the giving and 10 years of the slow, quiet hemorrhage, and the night at 2:12 in the morning, and the 4 days in the hospital, and the 5 sets of good china washed alone, she was still here, in her own house, at her own table, in the life that was still hers to shape. She was not finished, she was not done. She was, in fact, in some essential way, that she could not have accessed before all of this, only now beginning. Now, before we close this story, I need you to hear something directly, not as a conclusion to a video, and not as a prompt for comments, though I am going to ask for those too. I need you to hear this as the real and honest thing it is, the thing this entire story has been building toward from the first sentence. There are Sandra Holloways everywhere, in every city, in every family, in every church community and workplace and neighborhood in this country. Women who are pouring from cups they are never refilling. Women who have learned so early and so thoroughly that their value lives in their usefulness, that they have never been given permission to discover what they might be worth, simply for existing, simply for being present, simply for being loved, rather than needed. Women who are sitting right now at tables they set for people who did not come. Women who are lying awake at night, in houses they paid for themselves, listening to phones that ring in the dark and go unanswered, telling themselves the people they love are just busy, just distracted, just not ready, just going through something, telling themselves every version of the story that makes it possible to keep going, without looking at the full picture of what is actually true. If you are one of those women, if something in Sandra's story sat inside your chest, in the specific way that recognition sits, that feeling of being named rather than described, then hear this, as plainly as I can say it. What they did with your love was their failure, not yours. You were not wrong to love them. You were not wrong to give. The love was real. The giving was real. The failure was in the receiving. And that failure belongs to the people who did the receiving, not to you. But what you do next, the accounting you have been afraid to do, the call you have been afraid to make, the help you have been afraid to ask for, the trip you have been telling yourself someday about for 20 years, what you do next is yours, entirely and only yours. And you have been waiting long enough. If you know a Sandra, if you recognize someone in this story, someone in your life who is always the one who shows up, always the one who figures it out, always the one who absorbs the emergency and says it was nothing, and means it so completely that even she has stopped knowing it is not nothing, go be Gloria. Show up. Not with a text, not with carnations from a grocery store delivery service. Show up in person, with something real, and stay for 5 hours, and ask the question you actually want to know the answer to, and listen to what comes back, without managing it, or minimizing it, or redirecting it toward a more comfortable register. You might be the person who changes everything for someone who has been waiting their entire life to be genuinely seen. Drop a comment below, and tell me which moment in Sandra's story reached you. Tell us where you are watching from right now. We read every single comment, and we genuinely want to know. And if this story moved you, if it found something in you that needed to be found, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Not for this channel, for Sandra. For every woman who has been sitting at that table alone, who has been standing at that sink at 11:45 at night, washing dishes for people who did not come, who has been lying in the dark at 2 in the morning, listening to a phone that will not be answered, waiting for someone to show up with sunflowers. And if you have not subscribed yet, please do. Because the next story we are bringing to this channel is one I have been sitting with for weeks, and it is going to reach you in a place this one could not. Stay close. We are just getting started.